Christopher Nolan has never chosen the easy path. With the Odyssey, he completely rejects the idea of painting a dazzling portrait of Greek mythology or glorifying its immortal legends. Instead, the visionary director turns the film into a brutal, unflinching examination of the true nature of war, exposing the deepest wounds of humanity, wounds that have never fully healed. Look closely at every frame, and audiences will discover that Nolan has planted a series of hidden codes, razor-sharp historical lines, and countless powerful symbols throughout the film. Are you perceptive enough to uncover every dark secret Nolan has buried inside this masterpiece? Or will you fall into his trap, just as the people of Troy once did? Helen's scar and the lie called heroism. The Trojan War ends in devastation, smoke, and fire. But the image of victory painted by director Christopher Nolan is neither glorious nor triumphant. The film shocks audiences from the very beginning by casting black actress Lupita Nyong'o as Helen. This Helen does not possess the flawless beauty described in popular mythology. Instead, one side of her face bears a long, prominent scar. Nolan's choice is far from accidental. In Homer's epic poem The Iliad, Helen is described only by the phrase, white-armed Helen. In the ancient world, this was simply a way of describing noble women who did not work in the fields and therefore did not have sun-darkened skin. The phrase had nothing to do with race or ethnicity. It was only centuries later that poets began imagining Helen with golden hair. The playwright Euripides even embellished her story with the strange claim that she was born from an egg after the god Zeus transformed himself into a swan. Nolan understands that these details were products of later generations' imaginations. He strips away those layers of mythology and returns Helen to a far more brutal reality. A slave, a trophy of war, and a woman subjected to cruelty and abuse. The scar on Helen's face exposes the real reason behind the war. King Agamemnon did not launch 1,000 ships because his brother Menelaus had been dishonored. Nor did he do it in the name of romantic love. In reality, Troy occupied a highly valuable geographic position, controlling a strategic trade route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Agamemnon desired its enormous economic wealth and the power that came with controlling it. Helen was merely a convenient moral excuse, allowing the Greek king to deceive his soldiers and transform an act of conquest into an honorable campaign. When Troy falls, Helen is treated like property that must be reclaimed. She is passed from one man to another, threatened and tortured. When she later appears before Telemachus with a deep scar across her face, the image becomes a direct accusation against the hypocrisy of male rulers, men who invoke the language of love while concealing their hunger for wealth and power. That hypocrisy is also revealed through the character of Sinon and the Trojan horse. In traditional versions of Virgil's story, Sinon is a cunning Greek spy who uses deception to convince the Trojans to open their gates. In Nolan's film, however, Sinon is transformed into an innocent young farm boy. The Greeks abandon him beside the wooden horse after planting a false promise in his mind. They tell him that if he completes his mission, Antinous will provide lifelong financial support to his family back home. Believing them, the boy uses his genuine innocence to persuade the people of Troy to bring the horse inside the city walls. When the massacre begins that night, Sinon stands surrounded by screams and towering flames. He looks at Odysseus with stunned eyes and asks a single question. "Did you really have to lie to me?" That question leaves a painful moral wound that echoes throughout the entire film. It connects directly to the theme of the noble lie that appears repeatedly in Nolan's work. In The Prestige, Borden lives two parallel lives to protect the secret behind his illusion. In The Dark Knight, Batman accepts the blame for Harvey Dent's crimes to preserve Gotham's hope. In Interstellar, humanity survives by believing the lie behind Plan A. In The Odyssey, however, Nolan no longer romanticizes that kind of deception. The Trojan horse, an invention born from Odysseus's extraordinary intelligence, is no longer presented as a symbol of strategic brilliance. Instead, it appears as a weapon of mass destruction, echoing the atomic bomb in Oppenheimer. Both are products of human intellect. Both are carefully transported and positioned with the intention of ending a war. Yet both ultimately trigger a chain reaction that changes the world and ushers in a new age of slaughter. Intelligence used only to solve an immediate problem, while ignoring morality, creates injustice and spreads suffering among innocent people like Sinon. The brutality of war is condensed into one powerful scene near the middle of the film. After years lost at sea, Odysseus finally drifts back toward his homeland. His wife, Penelope, looks into his eyes and says, "You are the people from the sea." The line touches on a genuine historical mystery from the Bronze Age. Throughout the film, audiences hear stories about a mysterious force known as the Sea Peoples. These supposedly savage raiders were blamed for the collapse of major civilizations across the Mediterranean. But Penelope destroys that myth. The Sea Peoples were not an unknown force that appeared from nowhere. They were not monsters rising from the depths of the ocean. They were the Greek armies who called themselves heroes. From the perspective of the invaded people of Troy and the victims living along the Mediterranean coast, the Greek warriors, with their armor, swords, and endless greed, did not resemble heroes at all. They were raiders who looted cities, slaughtered women and children, and burned entire civilizations to the ground. Much like the shocking revelation in Interstellar that the force behind everything was humanity itself in the future, Nolan uses a gap in the historical record to offer his own answer. The destroyers of the ancient world were not foreign monsters. They were human beings who called themselves the victors. That brutal truth does not remain on the shores of Troy. It brands itself into Odysseus's mind and follows him out across the ocean. And there, the raging sea and the forces of nature are beginning to collect a debt paid in blood. The raging sea and the psychological verdict. As Odysseus's ship leaves behind the ashes of Troy and drifts into the open sea, the film shifts into a suffocating rhythm of loneliness and dread. By grounding the story in the realities of ancient seafaring, Nolan strips away the fantasy and confronts audiences with something far more terrifying. Sailors of that era had no compass, no reliable nautical charts, and no navigational equipment of any kind. A fleet could easily be swept off course by violent winds and storms, leaving its men stranded at sea for years. No divine magic would have been necessary. Poseidon does not appear as a majestic god rising from the waves with a trident in his hand. In the film, Poseidon is simply the name ancient people gave to their own helplessness and insignificance before the ocean's indifference. Blinding storms and waves as tall as buildings crush exhausted men into the hulls of their ships. The monsters Scylla and Charybdis are reimagined through a ruthless geographic reality. On one side lies a jagged reef waiting to tear open the ship's hull. On the other, a violent whirlpool forms where two powerful currents collide inside a narrow strait. The six-headed monster Scylla is revealed as an exaggerated image born from the terror of sailors watching their companions being swallowed one by waves and rocks. This realism reaches its peak inside the cave of the giant Polyphemus. Nolan completely rejects the use of computer-generated imagery for the scene. Instead, he creates the one-eyed giant through practical lighting and shadow effects captured directly on camera. Polyphemus appears only as an enormous black silhouette cast against the cave wall by the flickering light of a campfire. His heavy footsteps cause the small stones beneath the soldier's feet to tremble, while his deep animal-like breathing echoes through the confined space. By never allowing the audience to see the giant's face clearly, Nolan raises an unsettling question. Is Polyphemus truly a mythological creature? Or is he merely the product of a deadly rock slide combined with the panic and hallucinations of soldiers who have been trapped in darkness for too long, overwhelmed by exhaustion? That ambiguity makes the scene even more claustrophobic. It turns fear into something more immediate and believable than any digital creature could ever be. But the tragedy inside Polyphemus's cave is about more than fear. It marks the moment when Odysseus begins violating Zeus's sacred law of hospitality, known as Xenia. Xenia is not merely ordinary hospitality, it is one of the highest moral laws of the ancient world. A guest entering another person's home must respect the host and must not take anything without permission. In return, the host must treat the guest with kindness and dignity. Odysseus and his sailors enter Polyphemus's home without permission and eat his cheese before being invited. After escaping, Odysseus allows his pride to take control, and fires one final, unnecessary arrow simply to mock his enemy. That violation of Xenia repeats itself throughout the journey home. On every island they encounter, Odysseus's men do not behave like travelers, searching for a way back to their families. They behave like an occupying army. They invade the spaces of others, steal food, destroy property, and consider the consequences only after someone fights back. When the sorceress Circe transforms the sailors into pigs and tells them, "Return to your disguise," the line is not merely part of a magical spell. It suggests that their armor, their titles, and the heroic songs written about them are nothing more than disguises, layers covering the predatory instincts of men who have spent too long living through violence and bloodshed. That moral corruption leads to the sequence on Calypso's island, where the story of the Lotus Eaters is subtly woven into the narrative. In Homer's original epic, the lotus causes those who consume it to forget their homeland and abandon their desire to return. Nolan interprets the flower through the lens of modern medicine and psychology. The lotus is not a supernatural substance. It represents a sedative, a means of escaping post-traumatic stress disorder. The soldiers have emerged from the massacre of Troy carrying deep psychological wounds. They are haunted by the screams of women and children and by the images of their fallen companions. They crave the lotus because it gives them numbness. It erases their horrifying memories and allows them to sink into a false state of peace. The Song of the Sirens carries a similar meaning. It is not the voice of winged creatures living in the sea. It is the exhausted call coming from within the soldiers' own minds. After so much killing and loss, they no longer want to return home and face reality. They want to release their oars, surrender themselves to the depths, and end the endless cycle of haunting memories. Nolan gives physical form to that psychological torment and guilt through the goddess Athena. Throughout the film, Athena is the only god who appears in human form, but the face of the goddess of wisdom is neither majestic nor divine. Athena bears the face of a young Trojan woman who was raped and murdered by Greek soldiers on the steps of a temple during the night Troy fell. Every time Odysseus kneels to pray or sees Athena standing before him, he is actually confronting one of his own victims. When Odysseus asks why the gods cannot speak more clearly, Athena answers with a question: who does not understand pain? The pain she speaks of is the torment Odysseus carries after witnessing the young woman with that face collapse before him. It forces him to confront what his celebrated intelligence, the very intelligence Athena once cherished, has done to innocent lives. The face of the young Trojan woman becomes a moral sentence that follows Odysseus from island to island. Athena is not a supernatural protector. She is the reflection of his guilt and the embodiment of a psychological torment from which the king of Ithaca can never escape. That moral judgment grows heavier with every exhausted step Odysseus takes. It follows him across the raging seas and leads him back toward his former home, where another brutal reckoning is waiting. The oral epic and blood on the floor of the temple of Ithaca. When the story shifts back to Ithaca, the audience immediately senses an atmosphere of oppressive heat and exhaustion. Telemachus, played by Tom Holland, becomes the main narrative anchor during these scenes. Throughout the film, he repeatedly uses the phrase, "bright-eyed Athena." At first glance, this repetition might seem like a lack of variety in the screenplay. In reality, it is one of Nolan's most carefully planted artistic details. This directly pays tribute to scholar Emily Wilson's 2017 translation of the Odyssey. Wilson pointed out that earlier classical translations often removed or softened the heavy repetition found throughout Homer's poetry. In the ancient original, epic poetry came from an oral tradition. Traveling poets relied on fixed descriptive phrases, such as bright-eyed Athena and the wine-dark sea, as rhythmic anchors, making the verses easier to remember and perform before an audience. Nolan brings this ancient literary structure into the language of modern cinema. Telemachus's repeated words remind viewers that they are not simply watching a film. They are listening to an oral epic passed down across generations, a story that may change depending on who tells it. The distortion of oral storytelling becomes especially clear through the appearance of the bard near the beginning of the film. In his hand, he carries a wooden staff topped with a gold-covered bull's head, a detail that evokes the sacred cattle of the sun, god Helios, which Odysseus's sailors once slaughtered and stole. The bard begins singing of the victory at Troy as a magnificent achievement. He praises the wooden horse as a brilliant scheme that brought down the city amid triumphant cries. But Penelope orders him to stop. To her, the song is not a source of pride. It is a cruel reminder of loss and separation. The king of Sparta describes that moment as a catastrophic consequence of war. Odysseus himself ultimately concludes that the entire campaign was a relentless nightmare, one in which the Greeks slaughtered women and children and burned an entire world to the ground. By presenting three different perspectives on the same event, Nolan demonstrates that epic storytelling is never neutral. History may be written by the victors, but the truth survives in the cries of the victims. That deception and corruption have now taken root inside Odysseus's own home in Ithaca, where the suitors have established themselves. They enter the house as guests, yet remain there for years, consuming the family's livestock, wine, and wealth until almost nothing remains. They torment Penelope, threaten Telemachus, and attempt to seize the throne. They are committing a grave violation of Zeus's law of Xenia. When Odysseus returns disguised as a beggar and witnesses what has happened, he does not merely see a group of unfamiliar enemies. In Nolan's staging, Odysseus sees his own worst behavior being repeated inside his own home. What the suitors are doing to his family is exactly what he and the Greek soldiers did to civilians in Troy and across the islands of the Mediterranean. They entered other people's homes, consumed their possessions, and treated their laws with contempt. The punishment Odysseus is preparing to deliver is therefore more than personal revenge. It is a brutal act of purification for the very sins he once committed himself. That purification reaches its climax during the challenge of shooting an arrow through 12 axe heads. Once again, Nolan refuses to rely on computer-generated effects. The production team constructs a mechanical bow from wood and metal, using designs based on ancient weapons. The bow has an enormous draw weight, requiring genuine mechanical resistance and tremendous physical force. The image of Matt Damon using every ounce of strength in his body, his face contorted under the pressure and his hands beginning to bleed as he pulls back the bowstring, creates an extraordinarily powerful visual. The massive bow is not merely a weapon. It symbolizes the weight of kingship and the burden of guilt. The greedy suitors fail before it not because they are physically weak, but because they are opportunists. They are unworthy of the throne and unwilling to pay the price in blood, sacrifice, and responsibility that a true king must bear. The slaughter of the suitors inside the confined space of the Temple of Ithaca is not presented as a triumphant victory. It is a suffocating, savage bloodbath. Blood spreads across the temple floor, bringing one cycle of violence to an end through yet another act of violence. The Horse of Ashes and the Collapse of the Mythic Age. After punishing the suitors and reclaiming his throne, the film does not end with a grand celebration or a perfect happy ending. Nolan returns the audience to the prophecy of the blind seer Tiresias. In the epic, Tiresias foretells that Odysseus will not be able to remain in Ithaca for long. He must make one final journey deep inland, carrying an oar until he reaches people who have never known the sea and do not know what salt is. In the film's final sequence, Odysseus fulfills Penelope's wish. He holds her hand on the deck of a ship as they sail westward, chasing the setting sun. He explains that his time in Ithaca will be brief, not because death is approaching, but because he must accept a sentence of voluntary exile. The psychological trauma of the massacre at Troy, the sins committed against Sinon, the young woman whose face became Athena's, and the bloody slaughter inside his own home have left Odysseus incapable of living a normal life. He has become a permanent exile within his own mind. The film's most powerful final image returns the audience to the ash-covered shores of Troy. The enormous wooden horse, the object that set every victory and tragedy into motion, is now nothing more than a giant wooden skeleton burning fiercely in the darkness. Red flames reflect across the black surface of the sea as charred pieces of wood slowly fall into the water and disappear beneath the waves. The burning horse carries a profound symbolic meaning. It marks the end of an age. The wooden horse was supposedly created as a sacred offering to Athena. In reality, human beings turned it into an instrument of deception, betrayal, and mass slaughter. By violating Zeus's law of Xenia, and transforming spiritual belief into a weapon for violent ambition, humanity destroyed its own sacred connection to the divine world. The destruction of the wooden horse marks the end of the age of myth. Athena vanishes into the air. The Greek gods withdraw from the world of mortals. The ancient civilization that worshipped them collapses completely, giving way to a harsher new era, an age in which human beings must record history through truth and accept responsibility for the crimes committed by their own hands. In the final scene, Odysseus says that the songs preserving this story will be all the future has left to remember an age without written records. But those songs are no longer hymns celebrating heroes. They are anguished cries. They are bitter warnings about the price of war and the collapse of a civilization that created the very force that would ultimately destroy it. Outro Christopher Nolan has created an extraordinary cinematic work by stripping away the dazzling surface of mythology to expose the brutal truth of history. Through the Odyssey, the filmmaker poses a fierce and deeply reflective question to modern audiences. Have human beings spent thousands of years using mythology and heroic songs to conceal the crimes of war? We turn invaders into heroes. We transform massacres into glorious victories. And we blame gods or mysterious forces for tragedies created by our own hands. Odysseus is a king, a husband, a father, a warrior, and a master strategist. But to the people of Troy, he is simply a ruthless deceiver. To Sinon, he is the commander who used a lie to send a child to his death. To his crew, he is the only survivor left carrying the deaths of the men who never made it home. And to the young woman whose face became Athena's, he is the man who planned the massacre of her family. Nolan's The Odyssey is not merely the story of a lonely king trying to return home. It is the story of humanity's painful awakening to the brutal reality of violence. The film stands as a monumental cinematic achievement, connecting the enduring power of classical literature with the sharp, self-questioning artistic vision of a new era. Which hidden detail or symbol in this film impressed you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe so you never miss our next cinematic analysis.